Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so very much for being part of our very special IPCC session today. Thank you. I'm Natalie Isaacs. I am the founder of 1 Million Women, and I am talking to you today from Gadigal country. I am on the northern beaches of Sydney in lockdown, and I'm sending you all much love wherever you are. Across this country. I hope that you are well and you are safe and you are doing okay. So I'm very excited that 1 Million Women has joined forces with Australian Parents for Climate Action to bring you this session today. And so a very big hello to my fabulous 1 Million Women community, and a big hello to the wonderful Australian Parents for Climate Action. It is so good to see so many of you, and being connected at this time is just really important. And today we are digging deep on the recent
Natalie, you've just gone on mute.
There I am. I know that the climate news has been a lot to digest, and sometimes that we can feel overwhelmed, and sometimes that we slip into despair. But I can absolutely promise you all that when you stay in that place of action, it pulls you along, it sustains you, it builds your resilience, and it makes you determined. And I witness that every single day at 1 Million Women, and that's what today is all about. So I'm going to introduce you to Nick Seaton, the CEO of Australian Parents for Climate Action. Nick is going to do our acknowledgement for country, and he is going to get things started. And Nick, it has been such a pleasure collaborating with you on this. So over to you, Nick.
Oh, look, thank you very much. Yes, this really is a special event, a special collaboration. But I'd like to start by acknowledging that the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet, possibly, well, I'll start with my own. Look, I'm calling in from Sydney, and the traditional owners of the land on which I'm calling in from are the Gadigal people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their sovereignty and acknowledge that it was never ceded. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which each of you are present today. And we honour and pay respect to the culture, heritage and spirituality and continual culture of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, their elders past, present and emerging. And we acknowledge the pivotal role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people play and continue to play within the Australian community. We recognise as people who care about climate justice that there is no climate justice without the social justice for our First Nations people. So thank you. Thank you for coming along today. And yes, I'm really excited about this collaboration. I'm just going to check the numbers. We're looking at, look, nearly 400 people here already. It felt so amazing to see you all waving on the camera just now. Look, it's incredible. I'm really chuffed, especially to see you all at this time on a Friday. I've got 2 youngsters. I mean, I'm sure many of you are enjoying lockdown as much as we are. So thank you for making the time and effort and for coming along. I'd also like to, make it clear that it is actually a really important moment in time to be talking about climate change and to be coming together as a community. Not only do we have the IPCC report, which we'll hear about in a moment, but we're also coming up to the UN climate talks in November, where the Australian government are going to be presenting our ambitions. We also have a federal election coming up sometime soon. I'll take a poll as to when that might be, but that's our opportunity to put the government on notice and express how we feel about climate change. So there are so many ways that we can get involved, and I'd really like to invite you all to stay on the call, because we'll come back to how 1 Million Women and Australian Parents for Climate Action are going to be, creating opportunities and really inviting you to do everything that you can. And I'd also like to show my appreciation to everyone here on the call, as well as Natalie. Thank you for collaborating with us on this. It's absolutely fantastic. We've had over 1,000 people express interest in the resources that we're sharing today. So we're going to record this event and make it available to them as well. And that's all I've got for now. I'm going to pass back to Natalie. Nice to meet you. I'm the CEO of Australian Parents for Climate Action, and I'm really glad to see you here.
Oh, that's great, Nick. Thank you. And you're absolutely right. It's such an important time for climate action, and we all need to link arms. So I would like to take a moment to introduce our special guests today. And firstly, I'd like to welcome Professor Lesley Hughes, who is the former lead author of the IPCC report. And Lesley, I'm not going to say anything more about you because Jamila is going to be introducing you properly, but thank you so much for being here today with us, for sharing your knowledge, and thank you so much for the incredible work that you continue to do for us all. I was on a Zoom call the other night and listening to you talk about the IPCC report, and you unpacked it so well, and so we're very lucky to have you do that again with us. And Jamila Rizvi, thank you for being part of this session and for spending time talking to Lesley. It's really special having you with us. And for those of you who don't know Jamila, which I'm sure not many on this call, but I'll just tell you a few things about her. Jamila is the best-selling author and an opinion columnist for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And Jamila co-hosts 2 podcasts, The Weekend Briefing and Anonymous Was a Woman. She has advised governments at the highest level on gender equality and childcare, media and employment. And Jamila was named as one of the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence. So thank you, Jamila. So everybody sit back, or should I say, get your action hats on and enjoy this session. So Jamila, over to you.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you to Nick, and hello to all of you. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country, part of the Kulin Nation here in Melbourne. And I also want to acknowledge that First Nations people have been coming together and telling stories and caring for country and solving problems of catastrophic scale on this land for tens of thousands of years. And today we join a really important tradition. Thank you for showing up. I know we are all thoroughly exhausted by Zoom, but for me, you've gotten me out of an hour of homeschooling and drawing more Pokemon, so I actually really appreciate it. We have important and good work to do today. I am the parent of a little boy called Ruffy. He's 6 years old. And several years ago now was the first time I did the work to think about my then 2-year-old and think about what the world would look like for him well after I was gone, when he was in his 50s, 60s or 70s. The results of that research were terrifying, as everyone on this call knows all too well. That Australian parents are not more worked up and anxious and angry at the inaction by successive governments on behalf of their children and their children's children mystifies me. But moments like this one, where we see so many parents and so many women coming together to talk about what we can do, to talk about the influence that we have, the social influence we have, the economic influence we have, the political influence we have, is incredibly heartening. We all know that parents and women are so strongly connected in their local communities, in online communities like this one. We are connected through schools, childcares, kids' activities, all sorts of community organisations and groups. We have phenomenal influence. And we know that when it comes to questions of political action, so much influence is local, incredibly local, that you are more likely to influence someone who is related to you or someone you work with or someone you care for than you are to influence someone a long way away through a screen like this one who you will never meet and for whom you might not have that much in common. We know that this is a crucial time. We know that there is a federal election due sometime soon. That election will create a critical range of opportunities to engage and empower millions of women and parents in demonstrating their public will for climate action and to progress climate demands with MPs and candidates. We have to be ready. We have to be prepared to have those one-on-one difficult personal conversations. And today we're going to get armed with some information to help us do just that. Now I am going to introduce Professor Hughes, and then she's going to provide a presentation, after which we will have time for Q&A. So while you're listening, don't wait till the end. Please pop your questions into the chat. We will try to get to as many of them as we can. And I just want to try something out. If you've got a moment, can you please put in the chat for me 2 words that describe how you're feeling right now ahead of hearing Lesley's presentation? 2 words. They can be tired and anxious, or they can be optimistic and invigorated. Really keen to hear how you're feeling. And I'm going to check in again after that presentation as well. Thanks for those who are already diving in. So without further ado, Professor Lesley Hughes is a distinguished Professor of Biology and Pro-Vice Chancellor at Macquarie University. She has been researching the impacts of climate change on species and ecosystems for more than 20 years. She is a former lead author in the IPCC's 4th and 5th assessment report, a former federal climate commissioner, and now a councillor with the Climate Council of Australia. She is also a member of the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists and a director of WWF Australia. Over to you, Lesley.
Well, thanks so much, Jamila, and thank you everybody for showing up today. It's, I think, one of the biggest audiences I've ever had online, so it's wonderful that you're all here. We are running a book amongst the organisers as to how many people actually come, but I won't tell you my number. I'm coming to you today from Wallumattagal clan land of the Darug Nation in Sydney in lockdown, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to share my screen now. I hope everybody can see that. You should be able to see a picture of a bushfire. All right, let's get cracking. So I'm going to talk to you about climate change, why it's happening, what we can expect in the future, can we fix it, Australia's role, and then your role. And I'm just going to warn you, and this goes back to something that Nat just said, is that the first half of the talk at least will be pretty confronting, and a lot of you will find it pretty depressing. I hope the second half of the talk, however, may motivate you to act. So carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere has been going up and down through Earth's history. Up and down between about 180 parts per million and 280 parts per million. But come the Industrial Revolution, when we all discovered that burning coal was apparently a really good idea to produce energy, we've been putting more and more greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And today this graph shows where we're at. We're actually at about 50% more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than any time previously to the Industrial Revolution. Last June, a NASA report came out saying that, in fact, the result of this increased burning of fossil fuels is that the amount of heat actually trapped near the Earth's surface that affects our climate has actually doubled in the last 15 or 16 years. And the Earth was warming far faster than anybody has ever expected. Now I'm going to show you a little graphic to show you what's actually been happening with the temperature across the whole world. So this little animation has every country in the world listed in alphabetical order. So you can see Australia up there about halfway along that top line. It'll look at temperatures from 1900 through to 2018 using real data. And then it will project temperatures under about a medium range emissions scenario out to the end of this century. The blue colours will be the cooler than average years, and the orange and red colours will be the warmer than average years. And if you'll excuse the pun, it will take a little while to warm up, but then what's been going on will be pretty obvious. So let's get going. So that's real data up to that point. And now this is projected data, as I said, using about a medium range emission scenario. So not the most conservative, not the most optimistic, out to the 1990s. And really the moral of this animation is that it doesn't really matter whereabouts in the world you are, the world is getting very, very hot indeed. So the IPCC report that was released a couple of weeks ago has the tagline that climate change is widespread, rapid, and intensifying. Here's a few stats about that report. It was written by more than 200 authors. It received, of its 4 drafts, more than 78,000 comments. The scientists that wrote the report reviewed 14,000 scientific papers, has thousands of pages and more than 1 million words. So these IPCC reports are really international collaborations like no other in history. I'm going to go through in as simple a terms as I possibly can what to me are the key findings of this report. And for most of you, these key findings won't be at all surprising. I guess the thing about the IPCC report, though, is it provides all of the evidence for these findings. So the first one, of course, is that the scale and the pace at which humans are changing the climate system has almost no precedent in the geological history of the planet. Things are changing so fast. So since the 70s, global average temperatures have risen at about 200 times the rate of the last 7,000 years. And the current rates of CO2 and temperature change are almost unprecedented in the entire 4.5 billion year geological record of the planet. Second key finding, climate change and its impacts are accelerating. Here are some things that are happening. The oceans are absorbing about 90% of the excess heat in the system at the moment. And so we can now detect warming down to a depth of about 2 kilometres. The oceans are also absorbing a lot of that extra CO2 in the atmosphere, but that is changing the composition of seawater. It's making seawater more acid, and this is already affecting marine life. And our oceans on average now are about 30% more acid than they were in pre-industrial times. Glaciers are melting, they're retreating, and will continue to do so for many decades. And the problem with this is that glaciers are basically frozen reservoirs of fresh water. They supply water to about 1/6 of the world's population. So once the glaciers are gone, and many already have gone completely, that reservoir of water also disappears. The rate of ice sheet loss in the Arctic and the Antarctic has increased by about 4 times in the past decade compared to the decade of the 90s. And this is increasing the accelerating sea level rise. So sea levels are rising for 2 reasons. One is all that extra fresh water going in from the melting glaciers and polar ice sheets, but also because of the warming water occupying more space than cooler water. Warmer water is less dense, it occupies more volume. So as the oceans warm up, that also contributes to sea level rise. The rate of sea level rise has about doubled in the last few years compared to the average over the previous 4 decades. So once again, going back to the 70s. Cyclone intensity is increasing, so there's now serious consideration that we need a Category 6 cyclone. The water cycle is intensifying. What that means is that dry areas are getting drier, and so droughts are becoming more severe and longer and hotter, and wet areas are tending to become wetter. And whenever it does rain, that rain tends to come down in more intense bursts, and that's simply because there's more energy in the atmosphere. Extreme heat and heat waves are increasing globally, with 2020 being globally the hottest year on record, with the last 7 years being the hottest 7 on record. And as we all know here, bushfire seasons are lengthening and becoming more severe. In some parts of Australia, on average, bushfire seasons are now up to 2 months longer than they were a decade or so ago. But it's not just in Australia. The world is grappling with fires. So this is a graphic just taken on the 3rd of August, so just a couple of weeks ago, showing the extent of fires across the globe. We all saw fires on our TV screens in Italy and Turkey and Greece, but they're not the only places grappling with these bushfires. Third key finding, these worsening impacts of the climate are actually baked into the climate system for at least the next 2 decades. And what I mean by baked in is that because of the lag time in the climate system, the greenhouse gases that we've emitted over the last couple of decades will affect the climate that we get in the next couple of decades. So this, I'm not going to show you very many graphs, but I can't really not show you a couple. This is a graph from a Climate Council report showing the temperature rise that we've had so far, going back to 1850, and then the projected rise in temperature for 2025 and 2030. We are already locked in to a temperature increase of somewhere between 0.2 and 0.6 of a degree because of the greenhouse gases that we've already put into the atmosphere. That means that while the Earth has now warmed about 1.2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution, it's going to be greater than that, at least 1.3 to 1.7, and we should probably hit that 1.5 degree target that's embodied in the Paris Climate Agreement, and I will talk a bit more about that in a moment, by about the early 2030s. Fourth major finding in the report is that really catastrophic events known as tipping points cannot be ruled out. And the more we warm the planet, the closer we potentially get to these tipping points. So let me give you some examples of what these tipping points might be. And indeed, these things are already happening. So if I go clockwise from that top left-hand picture, it's a picture of the Amazonian rainforest burning. So the Amazon is starting to become a source of carbon dioxide rather than being a sink for carbon dioxide, helped along, unfortunately, by Brazilian government policies allowing people to clear and burn. The other top photo is of the permafrost up in places like Siberia and Russia. The permafrost is starting to melt. It's putting carbon into the atmosphere as those frozen sediments start to thaw out. And Siberia has also been on fire in the last couple of months. Then we've got the sea ice and the glaciers that I talked about previously. We're heading towards a time when all of the summer sea ice in the Arctic will have disappeared. And of course, things like coral bleaching keep going apace. It's been estimated that if we get to 2 degrees, most of the world's coral reefs, including the Great Barrier Reef, will be largely gone. Final key finding that I want to share is that the IPCC makes the point that the window for effective action is still there, but it's closing rapidly. It's still there, which means that the climate future is still in our hands, but it probably won't be in our hands for a great deal longer. This is probably the most important thing that I can tell you today. Let me briefly then talk about the Australian situation. Unlike the global record, 2019 was our actual record temperature for the hottest year. In 2019, we had 3 times the number of extremely hot days as in any year in the last century. And poor old Penrith, on a day in January in 2020, had the distinction of being the hottest place on Earth at nearly 49 degrees. Penrith, for those non-Sydney siders, is in Western Sydney. Australia, of course, heats up as global emissions rise. In fact, Australia has already warmed at the end of last year 1.44 degrees since records began in 1910. And in fact, over the last 5 years, our temperatures have been somewhat at the upper end of global warming projections. We tend to be a little bit more extreme in Australia than the average. Though it's not the average years that bring the worst impacts, it's those extreme years is when we get things like the bushfires and coral reef bleaching. The frequency of extreme events here in Australia is increasing sharply. So that last bar on this graph is 2019, showing how many more extreme heat events we experienced that year. And here in Australia, in fact, extreme heat and heat waves kill more people than all other weather-related events combined. People often are surprised by that, and that's because extreme heat doesn't leave the sort of scars on the landscape that are left by bushfires and storms and floods. Extreme heat is an insidious and silent killer, but it's actually the most important climate-related killer. Australian rainfall has been changing. So on this map, it shows what's been happening since the 1970s to our rainfall. So the greeny parts of that map are where it's been getting wetter, and you'll see that up in the northwest in particular, it's getting quite a lot wetter. But in the southwest and basically the eastern half of the country, we've been drying out. 2019 was not only the hottest year on record, it was also the driest. It was 40% on average below the average rainfall. And of course, those two climatic factors set up the perfect conditions for what's been called the Black Summer bushfires. Of course, Black Summer is a misnomer because those bushfires started in late July, so the end of winter, and they ran right through spring to summer and only ceased after New Year. 18 million hectares in Australia were burnt in that season, which is 3 times the size of Tasmania. And the impacts, of course, as we all remember, were enormous. There was about 3 billion animals killed or displaced, more than 3,000 homes lost. It's estimated to have been the costliest climate-related disaster in Australia's history at about $100 billion. But they're just the insured costs and the quantifiable costs. Many costs, of course, of an event like that simply cannot be quantified in dollars and cents. 33 people lost their lives directly in the fires, but there were another 400 approximately that died from the impacts of smoke inhalation, and there were more than 4,000 increased hospital admissions. 8 million of us were badly affected by smoke. In fact, the cost of extreme disasters, even without the Black Summer bushfires, has more than doubled since the 1970s. So don't let anybody tell you that climate change is just an environmental problem. It's absolutely an economic problem as well. Looking ahead, these are the sorts of things that the IPCC report projects. Heat waves and fire risk increasing, more marine heat waves causing more bleaching, higher ocean acidity, more intense rainfall, sea levels rising faster in Australia than the global average, with the severity of cyclones continuing to increase, and more regions affected by drought, especially in the southeast and the southwest. And here's just a couple of examples of what we might anticipate from extreme heat where many of us live. So in Western Sydney, we could be getting about 5 times the number of extreme hot days by the end of this century as we do currently. And 50-degree days in places like Sydney and Melbourne could become reasonably commonplace by 2050 or so. This is just an example of some recent, what I think is really interesting research where psychologists asked people in Australia what they were most worried about. And it came out that Australians are actually 3 times more worried about climate change than COVID. So there is a mental health crisis in and of itself caused by concern about climate change. I think that's a really interesting thing that we need to keep our eye on. So that's just a little bit of depressing news about what we've had and what we might expect in the future. So what do we do about it? Can we fix it? Well, you'll have all heard of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's an extremely important international framework for action. It aims to keep global temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, with an ambition to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees. Unfortunately, the pledges made to the Paris Climate Agreement thus far, even if they're met 100% and on time, will lead to about 3 degrees of warming. Remember, we've only had 1.2 so far. But we can tell what we need to do and when we need to do it by using a little algorithm called the carbon budget. And we can use this formula because the amount of warming that we get in the atmosphere is very, very closely correlated with the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere, mostly from burning fossil fuels. So we can use this budget to ask this question. For example, will we meet the 1.5 degree target? I already indicated early on in the talk that this was pretty unlikely. So we can use this little formula and say, well, at current emission rates of about 11.5 gigatons of carbon every year, we will actually spend the carbon budget, that is, put that carbon into the atmosphere for that amount of warming at present rates 2.5 years from now. Stay below 1.5, we would therefore need about a 5-fold increase in Paris pledges and their successful implementation. We can ask the same question, will we meet the 2 degree target or at least stay well below 2 degrees? Using the same formula, we've got about 9.5 years of carbon budget left, so about to 2030, before we will put too much into the atmosphere to stay below 2 degrees. So to meet this target, we actually need about a tripling of our global Paris pledges and meeting them successfully. Actually, to stay well below 2 degrees, then we actually have to globally halve emissions by about 2030. We have to be at net zero by 2040 at the latest. And 2050, which is often what people are aiming for in businesses and countries, net zero by 2050 is a very common catchphrase now. That's actually a decade too late. We've actually waited too long to reduce emissions for a safe climate to be achieved by net zero at 2050. And the thing is, the longer we wait, the harder it gets. You can think of emissions like a mountain that is growing all the time. We've got to get to the top of that mountain, come back down the other side. And the longer we delay getting to the top and coming down, the taller the mountain becomes. We know we have to leave about 90% of global coal reserves unburnt, unmined in the ground. Unfortunately, here in Australia, we are an enormous contributor to the global climate problem because we are the largest exporter of coal. We're the second largest exporter of thermal coal, which is what's used to make electricity, and the third largest exporter of fossil fuels in total, including oil and gas. Here in Australia, we also spend $10.3 billion, at least in the last financial year, of taxpayers' money subsidising fossil fuel companies. Now, the UN every year puts out what they call their Sustainable Development Goals report, where they judge every country in the world as to how well those countries are meeting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In the last report that had data up to the end of last year, the UN judged Australia to be number 35 out of 165 countries for meeting the goals across the board. But it also broke this results down to look at how well different countries were meeting individual goals. And goal number 13 is climate action and climate policy. And unfortunately, the UN ranked Australia last of all of the countries that it looked at, which was, I think, up to 200 on climate policy and climate action. In the previous report, we were second last, just ahead of Brunei, but now we are last. So if any politician tells you that we're doing well on emissions reduction, climate policy and climate action, it's an absolute load of rubbish. Now, the Climate Council put out a report called Aim High, Go Fast last March, where we calculated what Australia actually needs to do its fair share. And we calculated that based on what we've already put into the atmosphere and our capacity for renewable energy to replace fossil fuels, that we need to reduce emissions 75% below 2005 levels by 2030 and to reach net zero by 2035. This is in contrast to the federal government's current ambition, which is to reduce emissions 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. We now are all looking forward, I think, as Nick mentioned earlier, to COP26, which is the next big global climate meeting, which will occur in Glasgow, Scotland, where the signatories to the Paris Agreement are expected to increase their level, and certainly encouraged to increase their level of ambition. Thus far, Australia has indicated no change to either its 2030 target or a 2050 target, though it's generally thought pretty likely that the Prime Minister will announce a net zero by 2050 target at that meeting, or perhaps a bit before. As I said, we now know, based on the carbon budget, 2050 is too late. And what is really important is, of course, a plan to get there. Fortunately, lots of our allies and trading partners have a great deal greater ambition than Australia does. Here's some of those emissions reduction targets for 2030 by some of these countries. So the EU, 55% reduction, the US under Joe Biden, 50%, the UK, a whopping 68% ambition, Canada, 40 to 45, and Japan, 46. And I'll remind you about that really important thing in the IPCC report is that they absolutely say that the benefits of stronger action can be realised within our lifetime. So if we make those reductions really strongly, really soon, we will start to see the benefit in 20 to 30 years of a levelling off of global temperature and then moving into a safer climate space. So what do we need to actually do? Well, there are multiple scales of action because there are multiple causes of climate change. We actually have to work from the individuals through to communities, business, subnational, national, and international. All of those scales of action are important. For governments, for example, these are the sorts of things our governments need to be doing, is removing those fossil fuel subsidies, electrifying everything from manufacturing to electricity to transport, transforming the grid, all sorts of active transport, and certainly no new fossil fuel infrastructure or exploration. At an individual level, of course, there's many, many things that we can do. Change our diets, put our money not in fossil fuel investment, move to green power, join groups, consume less, many, many things. But I want to say something very specific about community organisations like Parents for Climate Action, like 1 Million Women. They're in the middle between what governments can do and what individuals can do. The power of the collective is really, really critical. And I think when people ask me what's the best thing that I can do, I say join a group, because you can be much more empowered with others that think like you. But I want to say something about the difference between concern and action. And I'll illustrate it like this. Imagine that this is a house. It's not my house, but imagine it's a house of somebody like me, a self-confessed greenie tree hugger, and it's got a lot of solar panels on its roof. Imagine this house is the house of a right-wing climate change denier who's put solar panels on his or her roof to save money on their electricity. They don't care about saving the human race. The thing is, if there's the same amount of solar panels, they're going to have the same amount of impact on the roof. And what I'm getting at here is the climate is actually not affected at all by what we think. It's actually only affected by what we do. So we actually have to move from sitting around on our couches shouting at the television saying, I'm really worried about this, and actually do something. But there's plenty of help out there. I'll just advertise a few things that the Climate Council puts out, lots of reports, lots of explainers, lots of resources. They're all free, they're all shareable. Please go and take a look if you haven't already. We also produce a whole lot of conversation guides for different sorts of situations. So one of the things you can do is talk about climate change with your friends and colleagues and family. And there's some guides there to help you. Here's a piece of really good news that happened a few days ago, which reported that the Australian Conservation Foundation's largest ever climate poll showed support for climate action at over 60% in virtually every single electorate in Australia. Let's just hope that carries through to the next election. Finally, I want to say something about being a parent myself, because being a parent is why I do what I do. Here's a graph, it's the last graph I'm going to show you, showing a couple of the temperature projections under different emissions scenarios taken from the IPCC report. The green one is the lowest emission scenario that might level off temperatures at somewhere between 1.5 and 2 degrees. The pink band is one of the higher emission scenarios, which would indicate that we could get at least 4 or more degrees of warming this century. Here's me, here's my lifespan. If I live till I'm 85, at the average temperature that I will experience over my lifespan, regardless of which of those emissions scenarios happen. I've got 2 kids, they're now in their mid-20s, and assuming they live till they're 85, this is what they will experience on average under that higher emissions scenario. Now, my kids don't have kids yet, but let's say my kids had kids when they were about 30. My grandchildren will therefore live well into the next century if they live till they're 85. And that's the temperature that they could experience on average, so close to 3 degrees over their lifespan. And of course, that's the average, not the extremes. So basically, this graph actually sums up why I work on climate change and why I think most of you on this call are actually here. So my final points, we are in a climate emergency. It is a code red for humanity. It's a fact, it's not just a slogan. We are seeing our physical and biological world transforming before our very eyes. And we don't have a lot of time. We've got this decade really to turn it around, and preferably we need to turn it around before 2030. Every fraction of a degree is doing us harm, so every further fraction of a degree that we warm really matters. And that means that every year matters, and of course, every choice matters. We have climate change because of billions and billions and billions of choices that have been made in the past and are currently being made, and we need to make much better choices. Thank you, everyone. I will hand back to Jamila.
Thank you so much, Lesley, and thank you everyone for your attention. I don't think I have ever seen something explained that is that complex, explained with such clarity and simplicity. So thank you so much to Professor Hughes for that presentation. I'm turning over to all of you, and we already have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to crack straight on in the hope we can get to as many of these as possible before we run out of time. Lesley, the first question is from Kate Hook. Kate has asked whether or not the IPCC's report looked at the impacts on society, and if so, what some of the examples were.
Okay, so the short answer is no, because the IPCC puts out 3 reports for each of their assessments. So I didn't go into this, but the IPCC does a major assessment about once every 7 years, and there are 3 different working groups. The first working group, which authored the report that I was just talking about, which always comes out first, is just on climate science. So it's just what's been happening, what could happen in the future. It's the second report, Working Group 2, which is the group that I've been involved in the past, which will look at impacts and adaptation and who's most vulnerable. So it'll be The second one, which will probably be out, I think, around about March next year. And then the third working group is the mitigation working group, which looks at the sort of solution space. How do we actually mitigate climate change? Now, of course, in the past, we do already know a lot about impacts. I didn't have time to go into them very much in this presentation, but for example, Oxfam put out a report last year which showed that about 20 million people a year globally are now being displaced by climate-related events, either directly or indirectly. So, you know, we know we have an enormous global refugee problem because of global conflict, but a lot of that is tied up also with climate change. So that's just one sort of impact. Another impact, of course, will be seen in our own people in the Torres Strait and in our Pacific Island neighbours. As sea levels rise, we will get to a situation where whole countries will be going underwater, and that's almost certain, and those people will have to move. So that's just a couple.
Thank you, Lesley. We've got a question from Adrienne. They ask, since the IPCC projections are conservative, is the actual experience that we're seeing at the moment following a conservative path or an acute path?
Well, the IPCC in this report actually put out 5 scenarios, and they range from low emissions, the sort of conservative, right to high emissions, the most acute, as you put it. So it's not that the IPCC is conservative, they actually put out a range of projections. I only showed a couple on that last graph, a low one and the second highest one. So the IPCC is very careful not to be policy prescriptive. Their role is to put out the science to underpin good policy and decision making, but it's up then to governments and decision makers to make decisions, hopefully based on that science.
We've got another question from Ellie, which is more of a personal question, I suppose, Lesley, and that is, how do you cope with these kinds of statistics at a personal level? Because I know a lot of us find it upsetting and distressing and something that keeps us up at night.
Yeah, look, it keeps me up at night at times as well, but I started working on climate change in about 1990. So I guess in some sense, it's been a slow burn for me, if I could use that terrible pun. When I started looking at it from a scientific perspective, it was more of a sort of academic, intellectual, interesting thing to look at, and it was all very much in the future. Of course, as time has gone on and climate change has accelerated, that's moved very much from future to now. So I think I've had longer to get used to the idea than the average person. You know, when I started, there was maybe a dozen biologists in Australia working on climate change, and that was it. And now there's hundreds and hundreds. But I think people often ask me, am I hopeful or optimistic about the future? And my response I give is that I think hope has got to be a strategy as much as it is an emotion. If we don't have hope and optimism, well, then we give up. And if we give up, you know, we're really screwed, frankly. So I don't have the luxury of not being hopeful. And I don't think any of us have the luxury of not being hopeful, because giving up really shouldn't be an option. So I just sort of take a sort of, I guess, a pragmatic approach to that emotion and say, well, I'm just going to, I do have dark days as well as hopeful days, and I just have to corral those dark thoughts into one little part of my brain and keep going with the other little part. But the other quote that I will share with you that I often put in things that I write is, it comes from Desmond Tutu. And when I read this quote a few years ago, I wrote it on a little post-it note and stuck it above my computer where I see it every day. And I won't get the exact quote right, but Desmond Tutu said, do your little bit of good where you are, because it's all those little bits of good added together that overwhelm the world. And so when I do start feeling overwhelmed personally, I actually come back to that quote and I tell myself, well, look, you just need to do your little bit of good, you know, focus on what you can do, decide what you can do well and do that. And hopefully all those other people out there who are also concerned are also doing their little bit of good, and collectively we can make a difference. So that's how I cope.
Professor Hughes, thank you so much for that answer. And I feel like that's the perfect point to end our Q&A. We have gone just a little bit over time. My apologies to those of you whose questions we didn't get to. It's a nice problem to have that there are just so many of you here today who wanted to hear from Professor Hughes. I'd like to check in with you again and do that 2-word check-in again. I know we've heard some pretty scary stuff today, but I know most of it is not news to the people on this call. I, for one, feel strengthened and empowered by information that will be useful to me at Christmas time when I'm arguing with Uncle Nigel and all of the people I will argue with between then and now. These conversations as individuals, the way we vote, the way we work as organisations, particularly the 2 organisations who are here today, is so important to making this fight a strong one, and one where we can continue to be hopeful, and that hope can be grounded in something that we're actually doing day to day. Thank you. It's lovely to see those responses. We really have had a shift, Lesley, in people's responses. At the start of this call, we were hearing comments like ignored, unheard, angry, disappointed, fatigued, exhausted, anxious. And now we're hearing messages like informed, inspired, determined, and energized. That is exactly where we need you all to be. So thank you for your attention. And please join me. We can't do a proper applause, but please join me in a virtual applause for Professor Lesley Hughes and her presentation today. You're going to have to imagine it because we're not taking everyone on mute.
I can see it.
I'm glad. And please share in the comments, everyone. We'll have a chance to look at them later and your feedback will be heard. That's it from me. I'm going to pass back over to Nick and Nat.
Thanks so much, Jamila. Really quickly, before you go, we'd just like to talk about some of the discrete actions that we can take and the amazing things that you can do with organisations like 1 Million Women and Australian Parents for Climate Action. I'll try and be brief, but if that applause had have been us in one place together, could you imagine how loud that would be? It's nearly 500 people. That's what we can't be together right now, but that's what it would sound like. We are very powerful. And I really want to extend my gratitude to everyone on this call, especially Jamila and Lesley and Natalie as well, for really bringing this together, because this is just the first step if we come together like this. So I'll try and keep this really brief. The key message for me is there's a way to do this, that we can do this, and that we can do this. And that's so exciting. I really want to acknowledge that if you have some heavy feelings about this, that is perfectly reasonable. That is an entirely reasonable response to such a difficult piece of information and news. But there are so many things that we can do. We do need to act together powerfully, and we can do that. I'd like to share with you one particular opportunity to join in with Australian Parents for Climate Action as we get ready to ramp up towards the election. We are determined to bring everyone along with us. We're calling this the Parents Pledge, but you do not need to be a parent. You could be a grandparent. You might not yet be a parent. You might have friends who are parents. As long as you care, you can join our campaign, because we're going to make sure that every voice represented by the numbers of people here gets included, gets amplified, and we can combine them to have such a big impact, because we do need to influence our local communities in our electorates. And we can do that so that we can shift the candidates, the current government and the future government, and that is not very far away. We know that Australia has the potential to become a renewable energy superpower with more jobs and opportunities than fossil fuels ever promised. And I know that that's so important because, like so many of you, I've got 2 kids. They are young enough, they're under 4, they're young enough to expect to live to 2100. And so a lot of what Lesley was just telling me was the story of their future, but it was the story of 2 choices. And one which I'm determined to make sure that we pursue is the one that has the certainty that we can get temperatures back to a safe limit. I'm really excited about that. So let's do this. Please, if you can, I'll share that link a few times because there's so many excited comments going through in the chat. Please do sign on to the Parents Pledge. I'll pass over to Natalie as well, because 1 Million Women are another incredible organisation that are pulling us in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Nick. And thank you so much, Lesley. You know, this was such an important session today. It has nourished my soul to see so many people on this call. We all need that. We need each other. And just hearing you helps us all. And for those of you who don't know, I'll be really quick, and thank you, Nick. For those of you who don't know much about 1 million, we are a movement of over 1 million women and girls across the globe. And our focus is very much on every single choice you make, the way that you live, how you use your voice, how you use your vote, and how you influence others. And we do spend a lot of our time trying to reach women and girls that actually sit outside of the Greenbelt and bring them in with action after action after action, where you see tangible results and bring them along this road of empowerment. But going to Lesley's point, I think what's another really important key thing for 1 million women is that we focus on optimism, on hope, on joy, on community, on collective action as a really key strategy to build resilience. And that is needed now more than ever. And so we've been working on our next chapter over these last few months to really work on what is the biggest impact that 1 million women can make over this coming year, these coming couple of years. What can we bring to the table? And so it's our commitment over this year and these next couple of years to go at scale. We want to increase our movement to 2 million and more. We want to empower as many women as we can to use their economic power to shift our money away from financial institutions that are still funding the fossil fuel industry. And we want to shift, we've got a big campaign that we're about to launch around that. We want to mobilize millions of women to get politically engaged in making climate action, the decisive issue for this next election. And on that personal action stuff, that is so important. We're going to focus on reducing 50% in 3 key areas: energy and embracing renewable energy and clean energy options, and food choices and overconsumption. So that's our goal and plan, and we need you all. So please join 1 million women if you haven't already, and really help us. And a big shout out to Australian Parents for Climate Action for all that you're doing. We need to link arms now and really go forth and just do what we can where we are. We've got 1 minute left, Nick. I'm going to throw it over to you and you throw it back to me and we'll say our goodbyes.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being part of this. Stay involved. Click on those links. We've got a long road ahead of us, but we can get through this. I just want to say thank you for making the time. It's an exceptional moment, a really difficult time for a lot of us. But yes, I really appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you to 1 million women for combining forces with us. This is such a wonderful collaboration that I hope we can continue.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for the great collaboration. Thank you, Lesley. Thank you, Jamila. Thank you, everybody, for being part of this. I just want to say that this is the decisive moment for climate action, and it needs us all. So let's truly love the earth like we do our family and our friends. Let's take a moment before we buy something and ask ourselves, do we really need it? Let's use our economic power for good through every choice we make. Let's raise our voices. Let's get politically engaged, and never ever underestimate the power that you have as one person and we have as a collective to change the world. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for being part of this today. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Stay safe.